Welcome to this edition of Diligence Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, and I'll be your host for today's show. Today, we're going to talk about cyber risk and the threat landscape, and it's going to be part of a two-part series on cyber risk. And joining me for part one is Matt Gorham, who's the Senior Managing Director of PwC's Cyber Risk and Regulation Practice. Welcome, Matt.
Thanks for having me today.
The past 18 months, corporate boards have had so much on their plate through all of the issues related to the pandemic and all the key social issues, which we've certainly seen in the news. And so much has been happening that it's almost pushed the oversight of cyber aside for a little bit as far as being a top attention from the board's perspective. But I will tell you that it hasn't taken long, for it to rear its ugly head again. And if you look at the most recent research, clearly it's the number one issue that keeps boards up at night again. So knowing that risk oversight is probably one of the top two duties that a board has, along with sort of finding the right CEO. Yet it's probably the most challenging duty in the sense of board members trying to get their arms around how to oversee something that they really don't know where it's coming from all the time. So I would say that it becomes the biggest threat. Cyber risk becomes the biggest threat to the sustainability of companies. Is that the way you see it as well?
It is. And I think it's that way, to think about how you phrased it or predicated it. During the pandemic, the attack surface of lots of organizations increased significantly. And we're dealing with a risk that is an inherent risk of cybersecurity, it kind of standalone. But it's also, if you think about cyber risk in terms of it's a central nervous system that's kind of interlaced with all of the enterprise risks that are being managed. So I think, as you look at cyber risk, it is a significant risk, it's a rising risk, and it's one that I think boards are going to be spending more and more time on as they wrestle with both understanding it and understanding how to mitigate it.
So when I think of the pandemic, I think of people working from home and the introduction of endless numbers of new devices that are all entry points for hackers and state-sponsored hacks or whatever, breaches or whatever it is. So I think the meat of having you on is for us to take a look at specific cyber threats. And I'm hoping that you're going to be able to sort of review and maybe even rank what are typically the most disruptive types of cyber incidences that affect both company operations and their bottom lines.
Yeah, I think when I look at the threats and I think about the landscape, I break them into two large categories. I'll talk about kind of nation state threats and risk and those posed by criminals. If you look at the nation state threats, I would say that's your pacing threat for detection and eviction. And what I mean by that is if a nation state has determined it's in their geopolitical interest to be on your systems, it's not realistic to think you can prevent them from getting on. But rather, you want to identify when they do get on, limit their ability to move laterally, and then quickly evict them from your systems. It is absolutely a significant and rising threat today, and it's rising because it's kind of we're going back to a new geopolitical paradigm, kind of back to great power competition. We're doing that at a time when there's increased technology for those nation states to compete on and compete with. And there's also, it's the confluence of no real established and consensus norms or red lines in cyberspace. So it is absolutely significant and rising. Really, four things we see from nation states today broadly. First is traditional espionage. And we've seen most recently significant supply chain attacks that was directed at as a traditional espionage activity. But the private sector's caught in between what would be spy on spy. And so, if you think about the number of folks that may be directly targeted for traditional espionage by a supply chain attack, the number of private sector collateral victims is probably much more significant. So that's an issue. We still see the second thing being the theft of intellectual property for commercialization. We see what I'll describe as hack and dump operations. That is breaking into a company that's aligned with a government, or breaking into an organization that is associated with a government, and then, for example, dumping their email holdings on the internet, particularly as it relates to disinformation. Imagine your email holdings were on the internet and peppered with false and fraudulent information, and how long would it take you to understand what was happening? And then the last thing we see from nation states these days are what I'll call access operations in furtherance of attack and actual attack. That is, getting access to critical infrastructure, maintaining that access should a country ever find in their geopolitical interest to conduct a destructive attack. And so those are really the things that are out there today that we see nation states doing. For me, attack activity is very significant. It's very troublesome. But the one that really kind of, as I look at the nation state's threat that concerns me the most, is the traditional espionage where a supply chain attack was utilized. I think, to me, because that impacts both the intended and collateral victims, really understanding your networks, understanding your dependencies, understanding where your suppliers get their code from, I think is really important today, and it certainly ranks up at the top of my concerns on the nation state side of things. On the criminal side of things today, what we predominantly see, the most prolific cyber criminal activity we see today, is really posed by Russian-speaking Eastern European criminal syndicates, grew up after the fall of the Soviet Union, and over the years really began to specialize. And so you had groups that specialized in malware development or infrastructure provisioning or cash out schemes, and those, or communications. And what that really allowed over time was a lowering of the bar of entry of those actors. And what I mean by that is, 25 years ago, if you wanted to be a good hacking organization, you had to do all those things I described and many more at a high level of technical acumen. Today, an otherwise credentialed group, not you or I, but an otherwise credentialed criminal group, could go into these dark web forums and purchase as a franchise everything they need to be a good hacking group. And so that lowering of the bar of entry has had significant impact on that ecosystem. I think what comes out of that ecosystem today that we're most concerned about is ransomware. And that's where predominantly we see the ransomware activity we see today. Over the last couple of years, we've seen some changes. First and foremost, a targeting methodology by these groups. That is, they're looking who's easily targetable. Kind of from a technical perspective, who does not have two-factor authentication on their system, who has the remote desktop protocol internet facing. And if you're easily targetable, that's the first tranche. And the second tranche is, if of those that are easily targetable, who would be susceptible to the extortion? That is, if we encrypt your systems, would you be inclined to make a business decision to pay a ransom? And then third, if you're easily targetable and susceptible to extortion, who pays the most? And that's what we see today with this, what's called oftentimes big game hunting ransomware attacks, where you've seen ransoms in excess of $100 million. I think, the other thing we see in this group is, or these groups, is sharing and collaboration in ways we haven't. Among those groups, we've seen them franchise in ways we haven't seen before. We've also seen what I'll call exfil before encryption events. That is, they may steal your email holdings prior to encrypting your systems and locking them up, just as another lever of extortion. So that's really the most significant criminal threat I think we face broadly today. that being ransomware on the criminal side and supply chain attacks on the nation state or national security side.
So, Matt, do you see much incidences of it happening internally, employee-based kind of stuff?
I think there's a lot of good work being done around insider threat. And there are certainly cases, some of which are edge cases, where that activity is taking place by somebody within the organization. But the vast majority of the activity is still conducted virtually, both because it's less provocative, less risky for these organizations, and because the attack surface or our companies are still susceptible to that. And so they make a business calculus as a criminal or a nation state, let me do it the easiest way. And generally, they're able to do that virtually without actually having to have the person do it inside.
So I have been, about 5 years ago, I had a chance to work with the FBI on this cyber risk related to the show. And they were spending a lot of time then on trying to make sure that they could develop a network with the companies and try and work together so that everybody was sharing, what was happening. I assume that has continued to go. So I'd like to hear your comment on that. And also if you would offer some final advice to corporate board members who must carry out this oversight duty, what would that be?
Yeah, first and foremost, as you know, I spent over 25 years in the FBI prior to coming to Price Waterhouse. And the last job I had there was as the assistant director of cyber. So the person responsible for all FBI investigations and operations in cyber. And partnership was a key tenet of what the FBI was trying to do then and is certainly trying to do now. I think without the partnership between the private sector and government, and I think this applies to the FBI as well as other organizations within government, for example, CISA, who has that defensive responsibility in the federal government, it's impossible to really address the threat the way it manifests. It requires the private sector and government to work together. And it's that network and understanding of the culture and equities of each other well before the incident occurs that will really allow that to take place. Perfect example is ransomware. If you're exchanging business cards the day the incident occurred, you're behind the curve in terms of being able to respond. You very much want to be able to call the FBI, get the information you can about the actors, what can you do? And the FBI and government very much benefits as well, is because they have a much more holistic view of the threat when people actually pick up the phone and call law enforcement and call the government when an incident takes place. I think, in terms of advice for board members, I think there are a number of things. First is, bake cybersecurity into your strategic decisions from the beginning. Always be thinking of it as both a risk on its own, but as well baked into all the other enterprise risks that you deal with. I think staying on top of that, both in an understanding of the cyber threat landscape, but also the legal and regulatory frameworks that are addressing it today. Lots of change in that space today. But I think for me, the most important thing as a board member is to look at cybersecurity and that risk posed there as another risk. Ask those probing questions. I would argue that board members very much know about risk. This is just another kind of risk. And so ask those probing questions. Ask get that dashboard that has that 10 or 12 metrics that really allow you to understand the maturity of your organization. And then ask those follow-up questions. I would encourage everyone to make themselves smart on cybersecurity because it really is something that is here to stay. And the more time you spend on it, the better you'll understand it and the more effective you'll be in your responsibilities as a board member.
Well, Matt, I again just want to say that I share your concern in this topic. It is very, very challenging for board members to stay on top of this, but it's going to take serious effort on their part to stay ahead of the curve. And hopefully this message will help inspire them to do that. And I certainly want to thank you for taking the time to join us and passing along your wisdom and knowledge.
Absolutely. Happy to have the opportunity to talk to you today.
And that will conclude this edition of Diligence Inside America's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week when we take another look at a critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.